Welcome everyone. Welcome to Startup Shuk. We are joined today with Shay. Shay David is the CEO and co-founder of Retrain.ai and previously also Kaltura, which I would love to discuss. And how are you, Shay?
I'm very good, and thanks for having me on the show today.
I'm glad I found you because I'm very interested in this world of SaaS AI and I'm currently trying to build my own. It would be amazing to learn from you. So let's talk a bit first about Shay. Who is Shay? What's your background?
So I'm a serial entrepreneur, born here in Israel. I spent much of my adult life abroad, mostly in the US, and then a few years in London. Recently moved back to Tel Aviv, just kind of in the right timing, some people would say, but pretty excited to be back here. And I've been on the border of startups and academia for most of my career, and we'll talk about it. I'll tell you some war stories, tell you maybe where the bodies are buried.
Right. I saw that you are very, very deep in academia. You have a lot of degrees from 4 different universities, Tel Aviv University, NYU, Yale. A lot of founders that I have invited, they have degrees, but not as much as you probably, because this is very interesting. I wanted to ask also later about the intersection between entrepreneurship and education. A lot of founders, they have very, very interesting opinions on education, like Elon Musk, Sam Altman. So I would love to hear yours. But before that, I want to ask your childhood, your background. Are you always this entrepreneurial person? What was young Shay like?
Yeah, I think that's something that you're probably born with. And I would say that entrepreneurs are probably born with some sense of dissatisfaction in the world. You see the world and you want to change something. If you wake up in the morning, probably as a kid or as a teenager, and life is happy, everything is good, you probably go to the beach. Entrepreneurs, I think, have in common some sense of dissatisfaction in a good way. I'm saying that you see the world and you have ideas about processes or things or objects or people or things in the environment or things in the economy that you could do better. And that's something that I remember strongly as a kid, always having ideas of patents and inventions and ways that things could be more efficient, more improved, more fun. That's something that I kind of grew up with.
And was this mostly from yourself before the army? And I want to talk about your experience in the military because a lot of founders, they gain a lot of sense of responsibility, also leadership skills, and this entrepreneurial mindset, can-do attitude from the military. What about yours?
I think mine probably developed early on. I spent most of my childhood in Israel, a few years in the valley in Palo Alto. So I think, that kind of gets to you by osmosis from the environment. So I grew up in the valley for 2 different periods of time, during my primary school and then during high school. And those were the early years of computing. This is where PCs were just being introduced to the public. Before there was kind of an IBM PC, my first computer was a TI-99, for example. So the Palo Alto Homebrew Computer Club was started just around then. So I was lucky enough to be in that area when kind of hacking culture began and the first world of computers began. And that, I think, gave me a lot of opportunity to basically get a strong sense of the changes that were to come. Today, most of this maybe seems trivial, but back in the early 80s and then in the early 90s, the introduction of computers, the significant role technology was going to play in our life was maybe not as obvious. And for those of us that were lucky enough to experience it, maybe we got a head start in understanding that something is changing in the world.
And did you get the chance to play around with like electronics like Steve Jobs did in his garage, building stuff?
A little bit. I had a job while I was a student in high school. I had a job at a small organization called the Palo Alto Computer Club. And our job was to build PCs from parts. Back then, you couldn't just go to the shop, to a Radio Shack or to a Best Buy and buy a computer. You had to order it from a special shop and they had to build it for you. And there was this German guy named Klaus who bet on me, thought that I was smart enough to go do this, hired me and a few other friends, and we would build computers from parts, from motherboards, and install the chips on them and format the drives and put a little software on it. So that was my first experience of like really building computers and putting my hands on the keyboard.
Wow, I'm so jealous right now. It's also part of my love, my appetite is in computers, electronics, putting stuff together. When I was young, I played with Arduinos, Raspberry Pis.
Yep.
But these days, those things are like ready.
Yep.
You can make anything you want with just a $5 board. But back then, I presume you have to.
Yeah, back then you had to know what you were doing, and there was a lot of interaction between the software and the hardware. So if you knew what you were doing, you could take, say, a motherboard, or you can take a hard drive controller, or you can take a sound card, and you can physically play with the hardware. You can there were like gates on the card, and you can jump in, you can do things like write double density on the hard drive. So you can turn a hard drive from 10 megabytes, I'm talking megabytes, not gigabytes, from 10 megabytes to 20 by changing the speed of writing on the drive, by manipulating the hardware, things like that. It's kind of fun.
No, that's so cool. And did you, is this the reason you end up in computer science in Tel Aviv University? But why Israel?
I was born in Israel, and I was there, and I came back to Israel to do my military duty. So I spent part of my high school with my family. My father used to work for the Israeli government, and we were on sabbatical in Palo Alto. He used to work for the aerospace industry, and then I had to come back and do my military duty. It was either coming back and doing my duty or staying abroad for many years, not having the ability to come back because I was going to skip the military. And for me, there was no real question. I came back to do my duty.
But you didn't thought of studying also in America?
Once I came back, I wanted to go back to America, but I decided to wait for grad school. So I did my military here, college here in Tel Aviv University. And then when I finished college, I went back to the States.
Did the military change you a lot? From what I've heard, you already have most of this entrepreneurial abilities before.
I think you gain a lot in the military. In the military, I was in the intelligence corps and I was flying drones and later commanding a drone unit. And later we'll talk about Retrain.ai, which is very focused on jobs of the future. Drone operation is probably one of the biggest rising jobs of the future. For me, that's kind of a job of the past. I did that over 30 years ago. And I say that to people and they're like, no way, you were flying drones 30 years ago. But yes, the military was very advanced in its technology. These are very early versions of drones. So the capability to bring a technological capability to the field was something that I think is very unique to the military, but also beyond the specifics. You know, you could be in combat, you can be in technological units, you can be in cyber, you can be in many other units. The military really teaches you lessons about the ability to extract from yourself things you didn't know existed. Teamwork, collaboration, command, control, community, many of the things that I think make you later a good entrepreneur and a good manager and a good human in general.
I actually applied to try to join, but I don't think I passed the clearance test.
Here in Israel.
Here in Israel.
Yeah,
it was before the war, but right now maybe it will change, but
Yep.
It was a long time ago. So you were born in Israel, studied in America for a bit, and then you come back for military and then for the first degree. What then led you to build Retrain? What was the founding story?
Retrain was many, many years later. So, I'm a serial entrepreneur. I was involved in many ventures, and Retrain is probably my third or fourth startup, depending how you count them. So we can get to that part of the story. But that idea took many years to develop. Prior to that, I was involved in several other startups, and I'm happy to tell you about kind of Destinator was the GPS navigation business. Even prior to that, another company called Mind Echo, which was a recommendation system. And I spent much of my professional career helping build a company called Cultura, which was a video platform. So we can talk about those and then maybe get to Retrain.ai.
Maybe, I should start with your early days in entrepreneurship. What was it like? What was your first venture and what prompted you to build that?
So my first venture, I got involved with a few good friends in a company that we called Mind Echo. And Mind Echo was a recommendation system. This was the early days, we're talking kind of early 90s, and we understood that something was going on. That something was called the internet. The internet was a way to connect people to like-minded communities. And one of the things that became apparent to us was that content was going to be proliferating, and that when communities of interest were going to form, whether around music or around video, these are many years before YouTube, before iTunes. The name of the game back then was applications like Napster, communication programs like ICQ, kind of very first generation social media, if you will. And one of the things that became apparent to us was that in a world where there's a plethora of content, finding the right content for the right people was going to be a limiting factor. When the cost of production of content drop, the cost of discovery of the right content increase. So systems that are gonna be decision support systems, recommendation systems that are gonna help users find the right content and media companies find the right audience, those were going to be important. So MindEcho developed a set of recommendation algorithms with an important caveat that it developed a super sophisticated recommendation algorithms 7 years before iTunes, for example, started selling individual media tracks. So we had the capability to match a movie to a person or a music track to a person or a piece of content like a joke or a character or funny video to a person, but there was no real easy way for people to consume content, because in music people were still used to buying albums, and in shows they were still tuned to live channels depending on what was there. So it was technology that was very much ahead of its time. It had the capability to make people's lives easier, but there was no easy way to consume that content. The funny thing about that story is that because we wanted to train the algorithms and there was no easy way to get the data, we thought we're going to train the algorithms on a data set that was going to be very engaging. And there was a database of jokes, caricatures, funny videos. We probably had the world's largest collection of jokes. And we would let people watch a funny video or listen to a funny audio or see a cartoon and rate it. And based on that rating, we built a profile, collaborative filtering. People who watch that also watch that, similar content to this and whatnot. And we had tremendously engaging metrics, but there was no real business model to that. So that was my lesson in time to market.
So what was your distribution? Do you work with media companies? Do you work with websites?
Yeah, we worked with media companies and we worked with mobile companies. Some of this was very early days of mobile internet. This was before 4G and 3G and 2G and WAP. So SMSs and links and stuff like that. And we ended up selling the IP of that company, but it never became a big business because, as I mentioned, this was my lesson of time to market. We have great technology, but it was a kind of example of a technology looking for an application rather than the other way around.
SISP, solution looking for a problem.
Exactly.
And did you build this yourself? You code it yourself, and what do you code it with?
No, this was with several other entrepreneurs. My good friend Shuk was the CEO, very smart guy. I was first the head of front-end development, and then I was doing business development. So several times throughout my career, I moved from technical roles to business roles.
I would love to talk about that as well, because a lot of engineering people who are technical, they can build stuff. They have to move on eventually. You cannot build the stuff yourself. But delegating is kind of a challenge because they want to keep coding and they want to keep building, and it's difficult. Anyway, moving on from My Echo, what led you to build your own next startup?
So the next startup was a startup called Destinator. And Destinator started with a very different business problem, but similar in the sense that something was going on with this idea of mobility and devices in the hands of people. And the problem we set out to build in Destinator, this was with my good friend Ron, who was the CEO and later also CEO at my other company, Cultura. Destinator wanted to solve the problem of personal mobility and the capability of personal navigation. The problem then is that mobile devices started to exist. People had, back then it was Palm Pilots and compact iPads. This was before the iPhone. This was early days of mobile computing, but the networks were not yet fully developed. So if you wanted to navigate with your device and to get points of interest and mapping and navigation, you needed to get the maps on the device, but the communication wasn't strong enough to be able to send you data on a regular basis. You needed to synchronize the device when you were offline, and then you could take it away and do your task, whether that was just personal navigation or, say, a delivery service as a business application or fleet tracking as a business application, whatnot. Multiple applications that depended on the capability of a single device to be able to find its location and be part of the network. GPS existed, but there was no easy way to get the maps on the devices. So Destinator set out to solve that problem. And we developed very strong map compression algorithms so that we can synchronize a big enough segment of the map so that people wouldn't kind of fall off the map. Today with electric vehicles, people have range anxiety. They're afraid they're going to go out of the range of the battery, right? Back in those days, people had range anxiety for the map. You synchronize the maps, and you were afraid, what happens if I drive beyond the map? So you needed to get a pretty big chunk of maps. So a country like Israel, you need to get the entire country synchronized because you might drive from one side to the next in the day, or all of Germany, or all of the UK, or all of the tri-state area, or all of the Northern California, for that matter. And getting that amount of data on those devices was very challenging because the devices had limited memory. So you had limited communication, limited memory. How do you solve that problem? The answer was very strong compression algorithms. And those compression algorithms, we call them the MP3 of navigation, because just like MP3 took audio quality, a CD quality audio, and compressed it to a point where the human ear couldn't really tell the difference, but the file sizes were dramatically smaller. We did the same for maps. So we could take huge GIS data sets, compress them, put them on the device, and then you could run multiple applications like tracking or like personal navigation. So that was kind of a big deal. That company did really well. And the business problem that we solved was that the alternative to being able to do that was to get a device that had much more CPU, much more memory, which meant it was much more expensive. The cheapest you can get personal navigation at the time was maybe, I want to say $600 or $700. And our idea was, hey, makes no sense to buy a navigation device for $600 or $700 where in your other pocket you're already carrying a device like a compact iPack or Palm Pilot 3 that already has the CPU and the memory and you're not using it, you're carrying two devices. What if we can get it to work in one, which using our compression we could. So all of a sudden for $300, you could get the form factor down, and all you had to do, you had to add a GPS antenna, and you had to buy the maps, and you can turn your $300 Palm Pilot into a navigation device that had the capabilities of a $700 Garmin or TomTom, or any of the other devices that were in the market. So that company did quite well.
How old were you?
Let me think about it. At that point in time, I was probably something like 28, 29.
And what about My Echo?
And Mind Echo, that was when I just got out of the military, so I was probably about 24, 25.
Not bad. Wow. I gotta keep up. It's amazing. I love hearing stories when people are still young and they build stuff, the genesis of a founder.
Yeah.
Moving on, let's talk about Kaltura now.
Yeah, so I had these two kind of experiences under my belt. The first was a very advanced technology that didn't have the application. The second was pretty successful technology that found its application. Ended up in Destinator, we ended up doing big OEM deals with HP and Acer and Lockheed Martin. There were defense applications. The company ended up being listed on NASDAQ via a reverse takeover in RTO. Today you'd call that a SPAC deal. And then it was taken private by a Canadian private equity firm. So that was a good run. And after that, I took a break and I went back to academia. To your earlier question, I always believed that there's a fine line. You have to rest and charge and study and learn the new ideas and be able to think for yourself for a few years. So I did a little stop and I went to Cornell to go get my PhD and rest in the mountains in Ithaca in the snow. Maybe, cool down a little bit from the hotness of industry, which was phenomenal a few years. And then I went to Yale to finish my postdoc for a couple of years, and after that I felt ready to go back to the industry. And while I was doing my postdoc at Yale, I met my good colleague Michal Tzur, an amazing entrepreneur herself. She had just come off another startup called Sayota, which was a cybersecurity, credit card security, and banking security company that got sold to RSA Security. So Michal was looking for her next big idea, and I was getting ready to get back to industry, and I was getting ready to go back, and most of us would collaborate on academic papers. We did our postdoc at a place called the Information Society Project at the Yale Law School. So we would write a lot about access to knowledge. And back then, there was a kind of a big rise of open source and open source innovation and open source licensing models. And we're very interested in that. We wrote academic papers trying to understand how people choose different open source models and open source licenses and how those get disseminated and how that get used, and rights attributions and many aspects related to kind of open source and open communities. And that was also related to my PhD.
What year was this?
This was in 2007, 2008.
2008?
Yeah, probably.
Okay.
So this was kind of the years the iPhone was coming, Linux was making a hit, and this was kind of very top of mind. And we thought, okay, with all these open innovation models, we see this happening on one hand on open source software like Linux, and on the other hand, we see this happening on other places like Wikipedia, this idea of access to knowledge via open knowledge communities and open systems. Mm-hmm. And that was also the area of my kind of academic expertise in my PhD. And Michal and I said, what if somebody took all of these ideas and applied them to video? Again, some of the ideas that I shared before on kind of Mind Echo, the idea that the cost of production of content was going down. The means of production that were available in everybody's pockets, 3 billion, 4 billion, 5 billion of these devices back then. Now it's probably 7 or 8 billion. Now there are probably more phones than people's. But back then we're talking about billions of devices in people's pockets. And our idea was, where is all that content going to go? And the answer was, it was either going to go locked in kind of proprietary systems with proprietary formats where nobody can touch it. And if you remember early days of iPhones, for example, the iPhone didn't have an app store, for example. There were no apps. And I say that to people and they're like amazed. The first version of the iPhone actually didn't have video capabilities. It has an app for a kind of stills camera, but it didn't have video recording capabilities.
The first one doesn't have?
It did not. And then they introduced the app store, and then they introduced video capabilities. But it was apparent that there was going to be proliferation of multimedia content in the world. And it was apparent to us that there's probably something there. If somebody was able to build kind of an open source version of this, where the formats are going to be open, where there's going to be interoperability, where a system of record to be able to control the media flows, that was going to be able to route the right media to the right people with the right access control, permission, rights management, security, safety, privacy, and the rest of the package that has to manage video. This was going to be something pretty big. So that was the idea behind Cultura. And we partnered with two other amazing entrepreneurs, Ron, who was my partner and CEO at Destiny previously, and Iran Atam, who became our CTO, and the four of us started the company and built it. It took a few years, but we built it into kind of an industry leader, got it to hundreds of millions of dollars in sales, took it public on Nasdaq a few years ago. So that was a very nice run and kind of riding the wave of that rise of media, rise of mobile media, and the rise of open information systems.
Wow. I want to ask a question about how do you spot these trends to work on? YC likes to say, if you want to work on a startup, work on a problem, focus on the problem first.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you find this idea spaces where they have very good problems to solve? A lot of the listeners are young entrepreneurs, and so they don't have this wealth of knowledge to spot really which areas to work on. They have the skill, but not the wisdom to spot which areas to work on. How do you find those?
So I think there are multiple approaches. The first is scratching a personal itch. In the early days of media, for example, how many times you might not remember that because you might be almost too young to remember the early days of kind of the format wars, but there would be many times where you'd get a file and you couldn't open it. Oh, because this was shot on an iPhone and I'm using Android, or I wanted to watch it on a PC. Or early days of video in Europe, there was one video standard called PAL, and in the US, NTSC. There were standard wars, there were device wars, there were format wars. You might remember early days, Adobe had Flash Media, Microsoft had Microsoft Media, and AVIs, those didn't co-play. You need to have multiple players on your device and whatnot. That's an example of a personal itch. Each one of us that was in this space, too many times you got a file, you couldn't open it. Or too many times you tried to stream something and it got stuck because it was encoded in the wrong resolution and whatnot. Sometimes you start with a personal problem like that, and then you have to investigate. Is the problem I'm feeling? How many other people are feeling that right now? How many people today try to open a video file that a friend sent them and couldn't do it because it was in the wrong format, right? Probably about 1 billion. So yeah, it's a personal itch. I'm scratching my personal itch, but it's probably pain for many other people. So that's one way to do it. Sometimes it's not necessarily the best way because you might miss out, right? Because you might represent a relatively small class of users, and also that personal itch problem is probably more relevant for kind of B2C and kind of consumer application, whereas an individual, you're probably not feeling the business problems. But, as you get into the market, you become an employee, you become a student, you're starting to feel business problems. So as a student, for example, again, related to Cultura, one of the biggest problems that universities had is that they didn't have a proper method to record lectures and to be able to grant access to media to students. One of the solutions Cultura developed, for example, was the capability to have universities connect all their media recording capabilities, index them properly, connect those to the learning management system so that students can watch the lectures as they missed them, use the material in order to learn for exams, get the transcription, get ADA compliant translation if you're visually impaired or hearing impaired, and be able to get kind of the group media if you're collaborating with media and some multimedia project and whatnot. So as a student, for example, you might feel those problems.
I think most students do indeed approach ed tech space because that's the wealth they have. That's about it, right? I'm a student, I go to university every day. This is the problem I spot. Yalla, let's build the problem. Or maybe social media. This is why Mark Zuckerberg built that. But the problem is these days it's very entrenched space. It's basically you have billions of students in the world building problems, solving problems for ed tech space. And I think the reason more and more students are trying to get industry experience and knowledge early on is to surpass the step and okay, let's move on to industry. What can I fix there? What would be your recommendation on how students can gain that awareness early on?
I think it's two things, and we can get back to those principles in many directions. But to me, it's user centricity and data centricity. Focus on the user. The user might be a business user, might be an employee, might be a director in a company, might be an IT person, might be a security person, doesn't matter. Focus on the problems that they have, 1. 2, focus on data. Don't just use hunches maybe to hone in on your idea, but use data in order to perfect it and figure it out. You're doing a cyber product. What is the pain the user is feeling? Oh, the user is feeling a pain because there are new threats and they need better monitoring service to identify new threats, blah, 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 whatever. Okay, that's a user pain, I understand. What data do you have to explain that this is a big problem? Why is competition not able to solve that problem, etc.?
And you gain those data from pure research, talking to people.
You have to do all of it. You have to be in the field. You have to talk to people. You have to talk to users. You have to feel that pain of waking up in the morning and feeling that some things could be done better.
You're mentioning something that's very similar to what YC says. They have two methods of building a startup: organically, sense the problem in your daily life, automatically build that solution, or intentionally you go to a vastly different industry and like just dive right in. There are founders in a company, I forgot what they're called, but it's in the trucking space, and the founders were from banking, and they just rent a truck, be a trucker for a while, live in the truck stops, and ask their future consumers.
Absolutely. I did that when I was a destinator. One of our customers was a food delivery company called Schwanz, and I actually flew to Minnesota to spend the day with those truckers. Start the day at 4 a.m. in the morning, but this was frozen food delivery, so they needed to go to the warehouse. This was all refrigerated trucks, and they had the limited times they could be on the road, so getting from one place to the next became very important for them. And one of the problems that they had is that somebody wasn't at home, they missed the delivery, and they had to go to the next one. They had initially, before using our product, they had printed instructions, but the instructions were only one way, so if they missed the delivery, they didn't really know how to get back. Again, this is days before you had Google Maps on your phone, so they didn't know how to go back. So we learned that the biggest problem that they had was, again, the capability to go between those multiple addresses, and obviously online navigation solved that for them. So yes, spending days in the field with truckers is definitely an important step, just as a metaphor. Depending on your business problems, you have to be in the field, listening to users and collecting data. Those would be my two biggest principles.
Even before Retrain.ai, I have a bunch of questions regarding like startups. How do you, let me pull one of them real quick, right?
Sure.
But I think one of the more important things in building a startup is the co-founders. That's literally the company. That's the definition of company, right?
Right.
How do you figure out who to work with?
Yeah, so I think you need people that really complement you. And that was true definitely for us at Kaltura with Michal, Ron, and Aran and myself, all very complementary in our capabilities. We had very good division of labor, very clear boundaries. We're all friends, but also good business collaborators. It's true for me in Retrain.ai. I have two amazing partners, Simone and Isabel Bickler. And Isabel and I have known each other for many years before we started the company, so we're good friends. And we met Avi and became good friends very quickly. So I think the first thing you have to look in co-founders is for the right people. Forget professional credentials, forget kind of nitty-gritty details of what exactly each of you is going to do later, which is very important. But day one, are these people that you also want to go have dinner with? Because if you're building a successful startup, if you're building a failed startup, it's going to take a year or two, you're going to fail. If you're building a good startup, an average time for a company to go public is between 11 and 13 years. So you're going to spend a decade with those people if you're successful. Are these people that you want to go have dinner with? Do you want to hang out with them on the weekend? It doesn't mean you have to hang out with them every weekend, but if it's not the type of people that you want to spend time with, that are in the same frequency as you are, that are working together with you to kind of expand you as a person and them as people, then forget the technical credentials or anything like that. It's just not going to work. You're gonna spend a lot of time with your co-founders, and you better get along really nicely.
They say it's like marriage, financially tight, you philosophically, like your vision,
It's probably even tighter than marriage, because in marriage 50% of the people get divorced, and it's the successful startups. You're kind of stuck with your co-founders. There's no easy way out. Typically for founders of companies that go out, there's very catastrophic economic outshots, because you maybe keep some of your equity, but if you leave before a good outcome, typically you get out with much less. So it's kind of like a Catholic marriage.
Skills can be gained, but trust must be earned in the beginning.
Correct. That's a very good statement, and that's a good segue maybe to talk about Retrain, which is all about skills. And the impetus for Retrain.ai was, again, a strong understanding that the market was changing. Kaltura went public, and I felt that I wanted to go do this again, but this time maybe solve an even bigger problem. And the problem we're solving at Retrain.ai is the skills gap. One of the things that I learned at Kaltura was that people were buying Kaltura's solutions. Kaltura was a kind of a leader in video, enterprise video, as I mentioned before. It was a way for enterprises to manage their video. And that was true for consumer applications and media customers like Disney and HBO and Vodafone. But many, maybe even most of Kaltura's customers were enterprises. And enterprises and universities and large organizations that had large amounts of video. And one of the things that I learned selling Kaltura to customers all over the world was one of the biggest problems that they had, was preserving organizational knowledge, preserving organizational skills, and using video for teaching and learning and enterprise development. And I always had this question in the back of my mind, saying, what sort of content are they using? They're willing to pay $50,000, $100,000, $200,000. The big enterprises maybe $1 million license just for the video components. And those video components were tools in a toolbox. They were having many other tools in that toolbox. If somebody's willing to pay $500,000 license just for one tool in a toolbox, they must have a pretty big problem.
Right.
What is that problem? That problem is the preservation of organizational knowledge and skills. If the killer use case for enterprise was learning and training, then learning and training for what end? For what purpose? The purpose was being able to make sure that the organization, as an organization, has the right skills, the right knowledge, the right know-how, the right processes, like finding the right people, onboarding the right people, teaching the right people, developing the right people, so that they can get the job done. Hence the idea for Retrain.ai, with the backdrop of AI and automation really changing the future of work as we know it. Dramatic acceleration with further acceleration by COVID of the introduction of AI and automation to pretty much every aspect of industry is changing the nature of business. And if you take both of those assumptions together, saying that organizations are really keen on making sure that they have the right skills and are willing to pay a lot of money to make sure that they find the right skills, develop the right skills, and continue to activate them on one hand. And on the other hand, the idea that AI, automation, and the fourth industrial revolution is disrupting the normal course of business, take both of those trends together, became apparent that there's a big need for a system that's going to help organizations become kind of a skill-based organization. And that's the genesis of Retrain.ai.
So you spot the problem and you found the need in the market. How do you validate that? I mean, you can spot the problem pretty quickly, but it's a different thing to
We talk to people and we find early customers and design partners. So, when you're building a business, it's like the old joke about the guy who has nothing to eat for dinner and sits in the town square and, he's kind of a traveling salesman, has really nothing. He had a bad week and sales were not good and doesn't have a penny in his pocket and comes to town and wants to eat and he's hungry and he's sitting in the town square and he's a traveling salesman on his wagon. He has his kind of a traveling salesman kit. So he has put together a little fire and he has one empty pot and he sits in the town square and he puts it in and he puts a big rock in it so that the pot doesn't fly away in the wind. And people start gathering around and asking him, hey, what are you cooking? He's like, I'm making stone soup. He's like, oh, I've never tasted stone soup. Can I try? He's like, sure, you can try, but what could you contribute? And the first guy says, oh, I can bring a carrot. Okay, fine, bring a carrot. Second guy comes around, what are you guys making? Oh, we're making stone and carrot soup. Do you want to in? Yes, sure. Okay, I'll bring an onion. And the third guy brings some chicken, and the fourth guy or girl brings bread, and before you know it, they have a feast. The early days of startups are a little bit like that. You come in with an idea that's like your pot and the stones. You have nothing much more. The first thing you got to do is create a vision of the future. What is it that you're creating? And then you need to find customers and employees and investors, not necessarily in that order. And everybody in the kind of first few weeks or first few months needs to believe that eventually you're going to have a pretty tasty soup. So that's what we did. We found investors that liked the idea enough to want to invest their first money. Then we found first customers that said, wow, if you build this, we can pay. And then we found employees that said, you have investors and customers who were willing to jump in and help build this.
So it's this momentum, and in the beginning, you are letting your customers also become co-founders and help your product evolve to finally become something that's actually useful to the market. This is a very good.
So we call those early customers design partners, and we make it very explicit to them that they are design partners, that they're buying a product that is not fully ready. The benefit to them is, one, they're probably going to get it pretty cheaply. Two, they get a seat around the table. Three, they can be design partners and part of innovation. So it's not right for everybody, but it's right for organizations that are very forward thinking. They have a big enough business problem to solve that they couldn't find a mature product, because if they could just shop around and buy it, they probably would. And that they want to really help because they understand this is part of something bigger.
Talk a bit about what you are building right now. What is Retrain doing right now, and how do you plan it going forward in 3-5 years from now?
Okay. So Retrain is building the world's most robust, actionable, fresh, and I would say advanced HR co-pilot. We're building an AI that is intended to help HR professionals take better decisions around HR from pre-hire to retire. Every organization in the world is looking for employees, but they're not just looking for any employees. They're looking for employees that have the right skills to get the job done. There's an old joke that says that a chicken is just a way of an egg to make another egg. By the same token, you can say that an employee is just an organization's way to collect skills. And I'm saying that in kind of in a funny way. But why would anybody hire anybody ever? The short answer is because they want that somebody to do something for them. And skills are the capacity to do work. So what an organization really wants when you hire somebody, onboard them, train them, keep them, retain them, develop them, is you want to develop the capacity to do work. Otherwise, everybody would go to the beach and swim, right? Or eat ice cream. But instead of that, we go to work because we're trying to get things done. So what Retrain is building is the most advanced skills framework ever to exist. We can ask the first question, which is what occupations exist, what roles exist, what are the skills necessary for those roles, and how could we build an AI that can help understand people, jobs, training pathways in a way that's going to help organization find those right skills, keep those right skills, develop those right skills. The upshot of all of this is, this maybe sounds complicated, but it's really simple. Our bots and our co-pilots allow people to hire faster, retain longer, and develop their talent more intelligently.
Amazing. And how do you see the future of AI shaping the tech industry?
Well, I think it's not just the tech industry, and this is an important point. The future of AI is going to shape most of the world. You know, some people, Sundar Pichai at Google thinks this is bigger than fire. Other people might call that, maybe kind of utopian or optimistic and say that AI is going to destroy the world. But I think people understand that this is going to have a pretty profound implication. I definitely think AI is bigger than internet, bigger than mobility, bigger than the iPhone and whatnot. So it's not just about shaping the tech industry, it's shaping industry and shaping society in general. And I think we're going to have two main impacts. The first is that there's going to be people that are excluded. And part of what Retrain.ai wants to do is make sure that those people are not excluded. These are people that don't have 21st century skills. If you read the economic headlines in the New York Times or in the Financial Times, you probably would be completely misled to believe that the problem right now is that AI is going to take over the world and there's not going to be jobs for anybody. Right. And the data suggests that this is absolutely not true. There's going to be significant displacement. There are going to be a lot of jobs lost, but there's a very good chance that the number of jobs created are going to be higher than the number of jobs destroyed. Here's where people get mixed up. They say, okay, let's look at the trucking industry or the driving industry. If you look at IRS forms in the US where you have to state your profession, driver is the single most prevalent occupation in the US. More than 2 million people are drivers. Imagine a world where there are self-driving trucks, self-driving cars. Those people don't have a job, right? Those drivers do not have a clear path to become Python programmers working for Waymo, working for Uber, building the technologies that displace them, right? But this is the mix-up that people say. And they say, okay, all these drivers are going to be out of jobs. There's no easy way for a driver to become a top-notch AI programmer, and therefore that driver is going to remain unemployed. This is not true. Because when you think about the self-driving trucking industry, for example, there are many, many other new roles that are being created, right? Like an AI auditor, safety inspectors, customer service representatives, and whatnot. Now, there's going to be major disruption. And for an individual that doesn't have the skills, that disruption might be quite painful. For the people that were in the mills in Manchester and Liverpool, come the invention of the steam engine. And mills were being motorized with centralized steam engines that would motorize a mill and take out 100 people, replace them with one steam engine. For those 100 individuals, the transition was very painful. The fact that mechanical engineering became a big profession 20 or 30 years later, and that there were now hundreds of people fixing steam engines, didn't help John Doe that just lost their job and lost their livelihood. And in the UK, where this happened in the first industrial revolution, with the steam engines, there was a whole movement called the Luddites, which literally would come at night and break the machines with hammers because they understood that technology was going to disrupt their business. But then came the second industrial revolution with electrification, and then came the third industrial revolution with communication. And each one of those first three iterations, the upshot was that there were more jobs created than jobs destroyed. The economy kept growing at a dramatically faster pace. So to some extent, there's historical evidence to suggest that this is going to happen again. And with this fourth industrial revolution, we're going to end up having more jobs than we've lost. The person probably who's the smartest writer on this is a guy named Carl Frey. He's the head of the Future Work Institute at Oxford. And his book, The Technology Trap, is a highly recommended reading. Maybe you can include it in the links, The Technology Trap. But that is hypothesis. We're not sure that that's going to happen. We're not sure that's going to help individuals. So what are we going to do in the meantime? In the meantime, we have to make sure that we have people that have the skills to work with the machines. Otherwise, we're going to have a class of people that are not just unemployed, they're going to be unemployable. If you're not going to develop 21st century skills, the capability to work with automation, the capability to work with people, so communication, collaboration, data analysis, data visualization, data automation, and things that have to do with that, you might be not just unemployed, unemployable. And at Retrain, we look very seriously at being able to measure not only hard skill, but also soft skills, and being able to create a career path for every employee, both low skill, mid skill, high skill, and basically create a route for the future for them so that they can go and do something that's in high demand. You have to map the demand, you have to map the skills, and you have to create an individualized career pathway for each individual to be able to participate in this modern economy.
So Retrain is like the wolf in the end of the pack that's making sure everyone's staying in line.
I think that's a good metaphor. I think that
no one's left behind.
We think of ourselves often as like a little demon sitting on HR's shoulders and whispering good advice in their ears, saying, hey, you might have missed that individual. Maybe they didn't go to the right college, but they do have the right skills because they participated in this, that, or the other project, and collaboration and communication are part of their skills, and you can do skills matching, for example. There's a bigger trend in the industry going on right now, which we're playing into, which is called the SBO journey. SBO standing for the skill-based organizational journey. Why? Because, again, despite the headlines in the economic press that says that soon enough there's going to be mass unemployment, the reality of the market right now is that unemployment in all the developed economies is at an all-time low. In the US, there hasn't been unemployment so low since the 1960s. Right, and people talking about macroeconomic trends and the soft landing in the US where interest rates have been rising, but unemployment remained low, right? The dearth of business right now is that it cannot find the right employees. Post-COVID, in both the UK, Germany, the US, there are probably 2 open jobs for every job seeker. Businesses are having a very hard time finding employees. And if that's the new normal, and I believe personally that this is going to be the new normal for the next 5, 10, 20 years, then people are in the driver's seat. Employees are in the driver's seat, and particularly employees that have the right skills. They're in the driver's seat, and they can find jobs fairly easily. Wages are rising, so employers need to be able to make very smart decisions about where they're going to find the next talent, how are they going to convince them to come in, how are they going to give them the skills that they need to do their job, and how are they going to create a career path for them that's going to be exciting, engaging, and puts the employee at the center.
Some people say that AI right now, with every new technology, is going to go through the hype cycle and the trough of disillusionment, and then finally the real players just remain. Where do you think we are right now? Because a lot of technologies are right now, people are calling themselves AI, but in the back it's a bunch of people from Bangladesh, fixing the code or whatever. Where do you think we are right now?
I think we're probably close to the peak of the hype cycle. I've heard this joke the other day, like what's the difference between AI and ML or machine learning? So AI is written in Python and ML is written in PowerPoint. But beyond the joke, I think you're right. Many people are trying to brand themselves as AI and machine learning and natural language processing and all those kind of alphabet soup buzzwords because people understand there's something there. To me, AI automation is nothing more and nothing less than the finding of patterns in data. So if there are applications that has to do with data and the capability to find patterns in those data and act on those patterns that you find, then that's probably fair use of the word AI, right? Regardless of whether it does that at human level or not at human level. And there are fairly many different applications today which have not yet truly been disrupted. Think about yourself. Your life as a student, for example, you have access to ChatGPT. It might help you write your college essay then, but most of your life, post-ChatGPT and pre-ChatGPT, have not really changed significantly, right? It would change significantly once the curriculum changes to understand that, you no longer need to write essays the way you used to write them 2 or 3 years ago. Another joke is that, I don't know if you've seen this movie American Pickle about a guy that falls into brine and kind of sleeps for 100 years and wakes up.
Yes.
And the premise of that movie is what happens to that person when they go into modern society. So let's take education as an example versus industry. If that person went into, say, an auto factory, he wouldn't know where they are, right? Because 100 years ago, there was maybe the Ford Model T. And if you go into a Tesla shop today to see how they manufacture Tesla 3, it's all automated, it's all robotics. That person wouldn't understand what's going on. But take that person that slept for 100 years and put him in a classroom in a university, they would feel right at home, because for 100 years, nothing really changed in the educational system. I'm just starting that with the premise to say, I think a lot of that is going to change. A lot of AI is going to change dramatically the idea of how we do education, because all of a sudden you can have personalization, and all of a sudden summarization becomes automatic, just like search does and whatnot. So I'm just using that as an example of where the height of the hype, soon enough we're going to fall through, but that plateau productivity, I think, is going to be pretty high. And I'm using education as an example of an industry that's going to be disrupted quite significantly, I believe, and that hadn't yet happened, which means we're not yet at the peak.
Right. Mark Cuban said, we are not in a bubble. It's still growing good, and a lot of really fruitful and productive companies are still coming out, not frauds like we've seen in the crypto, quote unquote, bubble. I want to talk a bit about your transition from, building stuff to managing, because a lot of technical founders, they love to build. I myself am technical. I like to code. I like to build this stuff myself. But the transition to getting the people, finding the talent who will build it for you and trusting them that they understand the vision of the product. How do you do that?
Yeah, so I think, sitting shotgun without every so often grabbing the wheel is pretty challenging. I think it starts by finding the right people that you trust. Just yesterday, I got a call from an investor who was looking for a reference about some entrepreneur. And I didn't know that individual, but I asked around in my network, and I got the reference from another person that worked for that individual. And he said, don't touch it with a stick, not a worth investment, because that manager would always override his team. His CTO would come in and say that something would take a month, and he would say, no, all of these guys are idiots, I could do it in 2 hours. So that's just a negative example of managers that obviously did not make that transition previously. So I think it starts with people. Find people that you trust. You're not going to be able to manage effectively if you don't trust your people. Basically, definitely on the technicals. The same, I think, is true on the go-to-market team, on marketing, on sales, on finance. You have to find really good people that you trust, and trust becomes the basis of management. So I think that would be kind of one principle. The second principle should probably be around avoiding what I call kind of the helicopter effect, which is, many managers say, okay, I found all these good people. I'm going to be the guy flying in on a helicopter to save the day. And typically when a helicopter flies into an emergency situation, two things happen. When the helicopter lands, it just gets dust in everybody's eyes, and the little work that was being done probably stops. And when the helicopter leaves, there's like this big vacuum and again dust. And many managers kind of fall into that pattern and make a big mistake. They think they're managing, because from the helicopter view, they just move from one area of the business. But the reality is they just create a lot of dust and a lot of wind. So definitely try to avoid that. Find areas in the business, but if you want to help, then go be with your troops. Don't just land there in a helicopter for 10 minutes, make a lot of wind and noise and dust, and then leave, because that's not going to be very helpful for the teams on the ground.
And you're not just trying to get them to help you. You must allow some space for them to make mistakes, probably, and let them understand how to do things right.
My personal method for intervention is called intervention points. The assumption is that most of the people do good things. There's this other joke where, at some point, hundreds of people might report to you. And my joke always was, I have 400 people reporting to me. That doesn't mean I tell them what to do. They do good stuff and report, right? So having somebody report to you doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to direct them in every detail of the way. They need to be independent. They need to be problem solvers. One of the biggest differences between, say, vice presidents in the company and regular employees is that employees manage problems and vice presidents manage results and outcomes. So find people that can manage outcomes. But where I was going with this is that my personal method is a method called intervention points. For every day, for every week, for every month, for every quarter, find the areas of the business that really are not working properly and that could be improved, and intervene in those. And assume that the rest of it is going to be fine. You don't have the attention as a manager to double down on everything. This is why you have deputies and lieutenants and vice presidents in the company. And if they can't do their job, you need to get rid of them and get better people, right? The assumption is that most of the functions of the company function well, even if you're not in the room. But sometimes things don't work well, and that's your opportunity as a manager to go and intervene. But don't do it helicopter style. Don't just land there 5 minutes, say a few smart things and go away. But you want to solve sales because sales is not working, then go spend time in the field with sales. You want to help solve the technical problems, and go read the literature, sit with the programmers and look at the Jira bug reports and get your hands dirty. And you can't do all of it every day, but you can switch between different tasks. And so long as that you're doing it seriously and you're staying focused, you could probably do a lot of different things in the company.
But this is in the context of a quite mature company. What about in an early stage startup with just 3 founders, 2 employees? How does it look like?
I think in the beginning, everybody does everything, right? And as the CEO, you need to give personal example. And as an entrepreneur, you need to put in the hours and put in the time and do everything. Early days of our startups, the culture is a good example. You know, we would go to trade shows, for example, and we'd have this little booth that came into this, big, I don't know if you've been to a trade show, but there are all these posters and they come in this big box that weighs probably like 100 pounds and you look left and right, but it's a 3-person company. There is no marketing team that's going to put this on a truck and ship it. You haul it with you. And for the longest time, Kaltura's booth was stored in my basement. And every few weeks we had a trade show, I'd have to haul that 100-pound box out of my basement and get a big Uber. And this was before the days of Uber, order a car service and haul it to the next place. And that's it. Is this the best time spent for a big manager at a company? If you're a young company, the answer is yes, because at that day in time, this is what you have to do. And when you increase your sales and you can afford yourself to hire a full-time event marketing person, then you're not going to have to do it on your own anymore. But at that day, that was the most important thing for you to do, and you do everything. As the company matures, there are multiple methods of dividing labor and dividing responsibility. The one I like most is a method called RACI, which stands for the division of who's responsible, accountable, coordinated with, and informed. And everything that happens in the company, you could fill in this matrix. Again, responsible, accountable, communicated with, or consulted with, and informed. There's a new customer in pre-sales, right? So the responsible is the VP of sales, and accountable is the chief revenue officer, and communicated with is the technical team for pre-sales, and informed is the R&D so that they know that more load is coming to the system, as an example. And you could do that for every process in the company. If you're building a big RACI matrix, then you would have all the processes in the organization and all the stakeholders in the company, and you build this matrix. And if you're disciplined about it, that's one way to do it, and basically kind of prepare for scale.
Talking about team, I want to expand on what you're doing right now in Retrain, which is getting Palestinian and Israeli to work together. How does it work right now?
We had that. That experiment never scaled for us. We had a lot of remote work. We had a small team in Palestine that were mostly focused on front end. We had a hard time getting talent, but for good reason, not because of tensions with Palestine, but just because there's just not enough talent. Some of the bigger companies like Microsoft hired a lot of the Palestinian talent that was there. There's probably not enough coding talent in Palestine. My hope is that this war ends soon. And that we can go back to that, and that more Palestinians are going to go get technical degrees so that there would be more talent. And in the interim, we've had more scaling experience with actually a team in Eastern Europe that's running some of them are out of Poland. Many of them are actually Ukrainian engineers that fled the war in Ukraine and settled in Poland and were looking for work. With global political instability all around, I think technology is a big unifier and actually gives people a lot of opportunity to stay connected.
I truly believe that. One of my goals with studying here in Israel, I'm from Indonesia, is that I want to unite the countries. We're stuck in this rock.
Yep.
I think it's inevitable that it will happen, and I want to be the one to help bridge the gap through economics, through startups. In my previous startup, my first one, which we had to wind down, but back then we managed to hire an Indonesian living in Indonesia, and we're based here in Tel Aviv. So I'm quite proud of that, and I hope in the future we have more of that and more of this economic collaboration between countries. One last thing about advice to entrepreneurs. We have spoke a lot about those, but I want you to maybe give one last thing about entrepreneurs. They all want to build stuff, but they don't really know what it takes, really. It takes a lot of character and a lot of perseverance this thing is not trivial and it's not easy. What would be your advice for people to really discover if this is for them or not? Because a lot of founders, when they're asked, so do you recommend people to no, don't do this. This is difficult. It's not for everyone. What are your thoughts on that?
I remember that before I went to get my PhD, I consulted with a professor friend, and he said, Shai, if you're bored, go read a book. Don't go pursue a PhD. So I would start with that advice. If somebody wants to do a startup because they're bored working for a corporate and they think that this is going to be fun, it's probably the wrong way to go about it. Go do a course on Coursera and Udemy, or take a break and go do the Annapurna Trail and come back energized and continue your job. Just because you're bored doesn't mean you have to start a startup. You have to have a very strong conviction There's something fundamentally wrong, and there's a big problem that nobody else in the world had solved, and that you yourself and the team you're thinking about putting together are the best people in the world to go and solve it. And if you can't pass that barrier, I would say don't start a company. You can go and do a project within your company, or you can go work for somebody else, but you have to have a very strong conviction that there's a very big problem and that you have the tools and the wherewithal and the capacity to go and solve it. Because again, especially in success, if you think, oh, I'm just going to do this real quick, I'm going to do this company 3 to 5 years, sell it to Google for $100 million. No, that doesn't really happen. Every so often there's like a quick win and people do that. But for every success like that, there are 1,000 that didn't succeed. Successful companies that grow to interesting enterprise scale for M&A or for IPO or for something meaningful to make a big dent in the world, it's between a decade and 2 decades. You need to make sure, is this problem big enough? Am I interested enough? Could I put a team together that's mature enough to go and do this for the next 10, 15 years? If the answer to that is no, then don't start it. It's just not the right thing for you.
What do you think about combining education with entrepreneurship? A lot of students want to become entrepreneurs because they're dissatisfied with the world. Like you said, you have to start from there, but they're busy.
There are some people like Peter Thiel who say, college is dead and they would actually pay scholarship with people to drop out of college. I don't necessarily believe that. I think that college education is not necessarily a prerequisite for being a good entrepreneur or success in life. But if you have the opportunity and if you have the privilege actually to go and take a few years off and go focus on your studies, I would do that. I look at college, or definitely kind of grad school, as a privilege. If you have that privilege and you can afford it, then go and do it and take some time off and do it. And, there's an old saying in Russian, work is not a wolf. It's not going to run into the forest. So that work is going to wait for you. That being said, if you have such a big idea and you happen to find a big problem or find an amazing team or find some solution looking for a problem and something happened, then life is short. Go and do it if you have the passion to do it, and then you can probably parallelize. But I don't subscribe to this idea of drop everything and solve your problem now because it's going to go away. If it's a big enough problem and it's tough enough to solve, it can wait a year or two until you finish school. And I think that the benefit of education, definitely of kind of a college degree, it's a time of learning, it's a time of experimentation, it's a time of you to really go deep into the topics, to build the foundations and to learn to be a better human and a better professional. So I would not urge people to go start startups when they're 20. Go finish your school, maybe develop a prototype, maybe use your schooling to gain the foundations, meet some people. I think that college campuses are a great place to meet co-founders and to basically start working with people. And, you can do an experiment. Go do a class project with people you think you might want to run a startup with and see how you guys get along. It's probably better use of your time than going out and trying to raise money and building it.
So I guess for people who are afraid of feeling left out with this opportunity that's right there, but they don't have enough wealth of skills and experience to solve it, is to think of it this way. You have a worm in your fishing rod. Don't waste it on a small fish you have in front of you. Yeah. Grow, and then you will find a bigger fish that will come.
I think so. A lot of times, especially these days, we talk about AI and software and whatnot, so it's a little fuzzy. But I always tell people, if you're building something that's like software or an app or AI or data, which is very hard to grasp, imagine that you're building a building, right? Do you have the right materials? Do you have the right skills? If I told you, go and build a physical building for me right now, and you would say, oh, but maybe I don't have the building materials or the tools or the money or the yard or the lots or the safety certificates or whatever it is that is required to build a building. If I told you, go build something physical out there in the world, immediately you would see the limitations. And what I'm suggesting is that building something in the virtual world and building software and building data is not very different than that. There are a lot of limitations. There are a lot of impediments. There's a lot of resources needed. And you need to make sure that you have sufficient starting point. You don't know where it's going to end. And, if you have a good idea, there's a very vibrant VC community. You can get investors and you can get employees. You can get designers. You can start small and grow. I'm not discouraging people from doing that. But you have to understand that in order to have a fair chance of success and to get into that funnel of 1 to 10, which sounds low, but it's pretty good, you have to have some minimum conditions to start. Otherwise, again, take that spirit, go work for a startup, gain experience, get traction in the world, and then, if you have a big enough idea, it's going to wait for you for another year or two.
Shay, it's been a pleasure talking to you. This has been a masterclass of entrepreneurship. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, and fantastic. And if anybody listening to us today has questions, you can always find me. Go check out Retrain.ai or Shay.David, Shay .David at Retrain.ai, or find me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to give advice, take questions, and help in any way I can. Entrepreneurship is my passion. I take community hours every week helping young entrepreneurs. And if you have a really cool idea, send me an email. I sometimes invest as an angel. So fill me in.
Intriguing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.